Hello, my name is Claire and I am Head of Fiscal Sustainability and Public Funding at the Scottish Fiscal Commission. This clip is one of a series of video explainers which aim to set out how the Scottish budget works, broken down into bite-sized chunks. This is the fourth part of our series on the Scottish budget. In previous videos, we talked about what the Scottish budget is and the tax and spending plans it contains. We also have a video on devolved social security. We now examine how the Scottish budget is funded and how that has changed since fiscal devolution. There is another video covering the budget process. You can find these other videos on the video explainer section of our website. In the 2000s and early 2010s, almost all the funding for the Scottish Government came through the block grant. Most of the block grant is the amount of money the Scottish Government got the year before. We call this the baseline. The baseline is then topped up or reduced when the UK government changes its spending plans in devolved areas. The effect of the change is worked out using the Barnett formula. Additions or reductions to the block grant are therefore called Barnett consequentials. Comparability factors show if a certain UK government departmental programme is devolved. If an area is devolved, the comparability factor is 100%. If an area is reserved, the comparability factor is 0%, which means that changes to plans generate no Barnett consequentials. This makes sense because the UK government department will be spending the money directly in or on behalf of Scotland. Some departments have programmes which are devolved and some programmes which are reserved. At spending reviews for each department, a weighted average of programmes is used to calculate their comparability factor. If the comparability factor is more than 0%, the amount is then multiplied by Scotland's population share of the relevant part of the UK. Most UK government department spending is only for England, but in some areas, for example justice, it also covers Wales. And that's how we get the formula for the Barnett consequentials. So let's work through a mock example. Say the UK government decides to increase funding for the NHS in England in 24-25 by an extra £500 million. We first look at the Department of Health and Social Care, and if that programme is devolved, which it is, so the comparability factor is 100%, we then look at how much Scotland's population is as a share of England's, that's around 9.8%. The resulting number, £49 million, is the Barnett consequential in 24-25 from this UK government decision. The Scottish Government can then decide what it does with that money. So that's how we get the block grant each year. Non-domestic rates, or NDR, is a local government tax. It was already administered separately in Scotland before devolution in 1998. Local authorities collect it, so the revenues are for local authorities. But as part of the Scottish budget, the Scottish Government redistributes the proceeds each year. Therefore, before fiscal devolution, the money the Scottish Government could choose how to allocate was the sum of the block grant and the revenues from non-domestic rates. The devolution of new tax and social security powers after 2016 meant funding arrangements had to change. The block grant remained in place, but both governments agreed to make adjustments to the block grant. These are called block grant adjustments, or BGAs. These reflect how much the UK government would have raised in devolved taxes and how much it would have spent on devolved social security benefits had devolution not taken place. So social security block grant adjustments add money to the Scottish budget, while the tax ones remove funding. Block grant adjustments began as the amount the UK government raised from each devolved tax or spent in each devolved benefit the year prior to devolution. Over time, they change based on trends in the equivalent tax revenues and equivalent spending on benefits in the rest of the UK. These remain under UK government policy. After the block grant adjustments, we get the net block grant. As you can see in the infographic, the net block grant is smaller as a result of the block grant adjustments. This is because tax BGAs, which remove funding, are larger than the social security ones. But of course, we now need to add in the devolved tax revenues. These are initially based on our forecasts. The Scottish Government can change devolved taxes, but whether these result in more funding for the budget depends on how revenues from the devolved taxes compare to their block grant adjustments. We call this comparison the tax net position. It can be positive or negative. It depends on how the performance of the Scottish devolved tax revenues compares to that in the rest of the UK. This relative performance depends on differences in tax policy. Scotland now has a more progressive income tax system. This means that tax rates increase as we go up the income distribution. It also depends on the different makeup of the Scottish and UK economies. We have seen slightly different trends over time. Differences between the Scottish and UK economies can have many causes. Some are demographic, for example, if Scotland has proportionately less migration than the rest of the UK. Some are social, for example, different rates of participation in the labour market. And some are sectoral, for example, oil and gas contributes more to the Scottish economy. When setting budgets, the tax net position is based on forecasts from two separate institutions, ourselves in the Scottish Fiscal Commission and our colleagues in the Office for Budget Responsibility. We are forecasting Scottish revenues, while the OBR forecasts UK government revenues. And this is important. The errors from both forecasters affect how much the final net tax position differs from the position forecast at the time of the budget. There are other sources of money that the Scottish Government can spend, as well as the net block grant and devolved tax revenues. Borrowing can increase funding in any one year. However, it carries interest and repaying it takes up resource funding in future years. The Scottish Government can borrow within set limits. Since 24-25, these limits grow with inflation. For resource borrowing, it is only available if there is unfavourable forecast errors in devolved taxes and social security. It is not possible to use it to fund day-to-day spending. The Scotland Reserve is a bit like a savings account. It lets the Scottish Government transfer funds between years. There is one account for each kind of funding: resource, capital, and financial transactions. The reserve's overall limit now rises with inflation, but its still small size means it can't be used to meaningfully save. The Scottish Government must leave space in the reserve to store underspends, and the size of these underspends only becomes clear towards the end of the financial year. If not enough room was left in the reserve for underspends, they would be lost. There is also funding from other sources. It's no longer just NDR revenues. It now includes things like revenues from the Scottish Crown Estate, which was devolved in the Scotland Act 2016. Finally, there's the corrections for errors in forecasts, which we call reconciliations. When setting budgets, all block grant adjustments and tax revenues are based on forecasts. Funding in future budgets is adjusted once the actual amounts raised and spent are known. Forecasts come from two separate institutions, the Scottish Fiscal Commission for tax revenues and the Office for Budget Responsibility for tax and social security block grant adjustments. So forecast errors come from two sources. Sometimes the errors offset each other if both forecasters get it wrong in the same direction. But sometimes the error is compounded if we make an error in opposite directions. Therefore, reconciliations can be positive or negative. If they are negative, the Scottish Government can borrow to help smooth the effects on funding. All that together gives the total amount the Scottish Government has available to spend. So, to recap what we've covered in this video, before 2016, the Scottish Government funding was just the block grant, which was regularly updated with the Barnett formula, and also the revenues from non-domestic rates. Since 2016, some taxes and social security payments have been devolved. The block grant remains in place, but both governments have agreed to adjustments to it, block grant adjustments, to account for this devolution. Tax devolution means the Scottish Government gets devolved tax revenue directly, but in return there is a reduction to the block grant. Whether there is more or less funding as a result of tax devolution depends on Scotland's tax performance relative to that of the rest of the UK. Other smaller funding powers were devolved too, and the Scottish Government can also borrow in some cases and use its reserve to move funding between years. The Scottish budget is now larger than it used to be, in part because it must also fund devolved social security spending. After these 4 clips, we hope you have gained a broad understanding about the Scottish budget and the fiscal framework. The only thing that is missing is to understand the sequence of how budgets are set and revised during their life cycle. This is the focus of our next and last clip. That's all for this one. We hope you have found it useful. If you are interested in knowing more, you can find the other videos in the Video Explainer section of our website. And if you have any feedback at all, please get in touch. Our email address is on the slide and in the description of the video.